I think I'm off though, Brennan. There I am. All right, we got our banging and clanging out of the way. Welcome to our Sunday school hour this morning. We're going to be in Numbers, primarily 29 and also 30. I think we did go through the description of the sacrifices in 28, did we not? I recall that we did that. I think we got through 28. If not, I don't see where we were. I think we did. There's a lot of repetition in the offerings. And someone asked me last week why such a copious quantity of sacrifices were required, because to us, we don't come to church and bring a goat, right, to slaughter up here. So it seems like an awful lot of animals getting slaughtered here in this nation. And largely, though, I want to remind you what we've been reading about in 28 and 29 those are not personal sacrifices. For the most part, much of that is like Passover required personal sacrifices. That was fairly limited in the amount. And there was guidelines for that. If your family was too small to consume the whole kid goat in one, you were supposed to bring in another family. You're supposed to share because there was not supposed to be any of that animal left till the next day. But this is national. These are animals that were sacrificed on behalf of the nation for the most part, and all the other sacrifices that were brought were for the nation. And you ought to compare this. So my undergrad background was actually international relations, international studies, but my focus was in Latin America. And so we studied what is normally called the indigenous civilizations in South America, what we would call Latin America now, and Central America, North America. And they all understood, as a friend of mine said, every culture understood that the gods were angry and they needed to be propitiated. But there were no guidelines, right? There were no guidelines as to how much blood was required and whose blood was required. And so they would go and gather every single human they could find that wasn't them and start sacrificing them until the drought got better or the famine got better. I don't know if you watched, it's kind of a niche nerd movie, kind of, but Apocalypto, the version that I watched, used the original tribal languages with English subtitles. There wasn't even any Spanish in it because that would have been anachronistic for that time. And they just have lines and lines of people, and all they did all day was sacrifice people and cut their hearts out of their bodies, human sacrifice. And so I want to compare, and there was no tally, there was no quota given. Well, if you sacrifice 10 of those guys, then the gods are going to be propitiated for this year. And that's what the pagans around were dealing with. They were dealing with an unknown. The God that they were trying to propitiate and please had not given them any revelation as to what was required of them in order to do that, right? And so the God of Israel says, don't you dare sacrifice a human to me because that's odious and abhorrent, and that's my image bearer, and I don't want my image sacrificed on an altar. But here, for the people, for the nation, remember, millions of folks, 603,000 just for the army, between 20 and 50, I think, plus the Levites, plus their families, plus their kids, all that. So when we amortize the amount of sacrifices over millions of people, it's actually very, very, very minor as far as what is required. So it is distinct, and I will say, even though it is unpopular, it is superior to know, right, what the God that you worship requires. Yes? Right? I mean, that's what everybody's running around trying to make their God happy. And for many people, it's them. Do you know how few people know what makes them happy? And yet they're trying to live their lives pleasing to their greatest good, their best life now, whatever you want to call it. They don't even know what that is. They don't even know what makes them happy. They're too stupid to figure it out, quite frankly. Most humans are. Who are trying to worship themselves and have made an idol out of themselves or humanity as a whole. People who feel that they can do so through their philanthropic efforts. I could point to a lot of massive philanthropic efforts that have done nothing but fill up the prisons and make drug addicts and terrible people out of the people they were trying to help. And so God didn't do that. So these are the standards. This is what you're required to do, and it's fairly limited. And I've consecrated people to do it for you, to do it properly. I have consecrated a land so that you never have a shortage of people and resources to produce these things, and a shortage of people to sacrifice them properly. And so it's very limited. It's very efficient. And people look at the law sometimes in church, and this is foolish. They look at the whole of the law in the Old Testament, and they say, well, look at how legalistic that is. Look at how harsh that is. Look at how difficult it is. And I don't think those people have ever looked at a copy of our own tax code or the federal firearms code that the ATF continues to expand at a breakneck speed every time we turn around. And you have to remember that the number of laws, and the common number is quoted as 613, which is not accurate. It's more like 250 something, I think, actual laws to run a whole nation. And all of a sudden you realize that the Mosaic Law is actually the gold standard for what we call minarchism, right? You know what minarchism, you know what anarchy is, right? Anarchy means no government. We all know that doesn't work, right? Minarchy is a different standard. The government leaves us alone as much as possible, right? That's kind of where I'm at. I want the government out of my business most all of the time. And that's kind of the Mosaic standard. So anyway, before we get going, I just want you to keep those things in mind, because Numbers is given a bad rap. A lot of times we're having a lot of unnecessary detail and being oppressive. And compared to modern standards, it's almost like having no government at all, really. So let's look at it. Verse 1 of 29. No, okay, so you see my shofar collection. This isn't actually even the whole thing, because I collect these things. I can't really play stringed instruments anymore, so all I can do is blow into a trumpet. So we'll come up to this here in a second. As it's right in verse 1. Now in the 7th month, that's the month of Tishrei, on the 1st day of the month you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. It will be to you a day for blowing trumpets. So we just recently celebrated Independence Day, right, in July. And if you live near me anyway, you realize that people really like fireworks, because that's what we do on July 4th. In 2020, when our county government decided that they were going to keep you from celebrating any and all holidays, the way that you have been accustomed to, the number of fireworks was probably 20 times what it was this last July 4th. Maybe you don't realize this, but that's supposed to symbolize the guns and the cannon fire that won us our independence. By the way, it's not just because we like loud noises, right? I actually don't like loud noises. If I'm not participating, I act like I've been in combat. I jump out of bed and want to shoot somebody when I start hearing those. But that's how it is. And that was a commemoration, right? The commemoration that God set for Israel on the first day of the 7th month is the blowing of trumpets. Now, I haven't been practicing my trumpet blowing, and one of these I blow quite a bit better than the other. But I will demonstrate it to you anyway. This is a Yemenite shofar. This is not what Moses was talking about. This is a ram's horn shofar. This one is actually made. This is the real deal, man. This is kosher, made by a kosher shofar company out of Israel, and I ordered it. They get bigger than this. This one is kind of hard for me to play, and it sounds kind of Mickey Mouse, actually, but it is loud. The tone of this one, even though it is high, you can hear for a long way. If I go out front and blow this one towards Donovan, you can hear it for a long way, and if you know what you're listening to. This one is down in the range where you might think it's traffic rumble if I were to blow it across that road. So these are what they're talking about. In other words, if you've seen Sunday school material where they have the same kind of trumpets and bugles that you see in the John Wayne movies, you know, that's not what they're playing. They didn't have that kind of metal work. They're blowing these, okay? And there's been a revival of these. I was talking to the Fergusons here. If you go and look, there's modern iterations of what it's called a klezmer band. You all know what klezmer bands are, the Eastern European, probably what you think of as Jewish music, which is not really Jewish music. It's Eastern European Jewish music, where they're using Western instruments, but they've revised it to use some of these, and people are very skilled in the way that they can alter the airflow and the position of their lips so that they can actually play notes. I'm not that good. But that's not the traditional usage of it. In the temple and synagogue worship, there's two uses, one long blast and one that is three short blasts. The first one is called a tekiah, and I forget what the second one is called. But this was not that even. Everyone was supposed to have a shofar, right? You go out and everybody's supposed to go blow their trumpets in the street. That was kind of cool. You could just participate. It wasn't something for just the priest to do. And they were supposed to take a break so that they could go out and blow trumpets. A holy convocation. They're supposed to get together and blow trumpets together. Sounds like a fun idea in my mind, generally. It kind of reminds you of that closing scene in Mary Poppins where the whole town is out flying kites together, right? Having fun together. Y'all do know, remember how to do that? I sometimes forget. In fact, I'll tell my wife, I don't remember what I used to do to have fun anymore. It's been a while. But this sounds fun to me as a celebration. And it was the whole community, not just your family getting together and doing it. So there's an offering involved. You shall offer a burnt offering as a soothing aroma to Yahweh, 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs, 1 year old without defect. Also their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull, 2/10 for the ram, and 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs. Offer 1 male goat for a sin offering to make atonement for you, besides the burnt offering of the new moon and its grain offering and the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and their drink offerings according to their ordinance for a soothing aroma, an offering by fire to Yahweh. Now, you can remember when you read a sin offering like this, a lot of people have a mistake that they make in their minds. And I actually wrote an article for this article length section for a book that was published called What is Dispensationalism? And in that I describe what I think the animal sacrifices were for. Because a lot of people say something foolish, and that is that the blood of bulls, rams, and goats and all that actually did play a part in people going to heaven when they die in the Old Testament. That was not what that was for, right? An atonement, so we use that word wrongly in the New Testament when we say atonement. Atonement is actually not really a New Testament word, it's an Old Testament word. And it means to cover something, you're covered. It describes what God has imputed essentially in that situation. You are now restored. I take it to be a fellowship term. And that is that you no longer, by virtue of confession, which is what the cyclical sacrifice of animals was designed to do. So they say, I understand that I'm imperfect and that I'm approaching a perfect God. And I'm going to come in obedience, and I'm confessing to you that I'm imperfect. And God says, okay, you're covered. You're covered. Nothing intrinsic to the blood did that precisely, but you're covered. I'm propitiated. I'm not going to put you under discipline anymore because you acknowledge your position before me. And if you'd like a copy, I actually have some copies of that book that you're welcome to have, or I can make you a copy of the article if you want a little bit more in-depth description of that. But that's what's happening, is that the people are confessing to the Lord and telling him, look, we don't need discipline right now. We don't need to be corrected. We are agreeing with you as to where we stand. And that's what this is for. So you offer 1 male goat for a sin offering to make an atonement for you, besides the burnt offering of the new moon and its grain offering and the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and their drink offerings, according to their ordinance, for a soothing aroma, an offering by fire to Yahweh. So 1 time a year, there was this additional sacrifice level that they were supposed to add to the new moon offering. That is what we call Rosh Hashanah, by the way, these days. Refer to it as the new year. Verse 7. Oh, actually, I have... Hey, Brennan, did you happen to get my PowerPoint? Is it up or no? Can I control it? I can, can't I? I've been... Yeah. Okay. Yes, ma'am. No, that's okay. As I'm reading, this is the national sacrifice, so they're supposed to add this. Remember, there was a continual burnt offering that was going on. There were continual cyclical offerings, and they're adding, saying that this is in the normal schedule. All these other things were going to be offered, and we're adding to this one male goat. And that's why I wanted to point out that in the pagan cultures, even in more modern eras, talking about 500-600 years ago, nobody had any idea how much blood propitiated or made atonement for how they had offended the gods. They just knew they were angry, right? In this case, God says, look, I'm going to let you cover everything with one goat. One goat. So it's categorically different, massively superior. And we understand that it is not the quantity of the blood, but the attitude of the people offering it right at that point, because, but that's what he said. These guys are blowing the Yemenite shofars here. I didn't have a picture of the other ones, but this is one everybody wants to see, right? Y'all think these are pretty, these shofars, right? You can blow a ram's horn shofar, nobody has any idea what you got on your face, but for whatever reason they recognize that one. So that's Rosh Hashanah. This is another goat's going to get offered here. So the Rosh Hashanah, you can remember, is the trumpets. Then on that same month, Verse 7, then on the 10th day of the 7th month you shall have a holy convocation. You shall humble yourselves. You shall not do any work. I think that part would kill me. All these days of not doing any work, man, I must be addicted. But, that's what they're supposed to do. No laborious work, anyway. Not supposed to do any work. You shall present a burnt offering to Yahweh as a soothing aroma, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 year old, having them without defect, and their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull, 2/10 for the 1 ram, and 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs, 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the sin offering of atonement, and the continual burnt offering, and its grain offering, and their drink offerings. Okay, so that's Yom Kippur. Most people know about Yom Kippur if they've studied more recent history, because there was a war called the Yom Kippur War fought in modern-day Israel, right? But the holiday, the reason it was war is because they were attacked on their holy day when they weren't supposed to be able to fight back, essentially, because they're not supposed to do any work. But Jesus clarified that you're supposed to preserve life, right? Even on a high holy day, you're not supposed to lay over and let your enemies run over you. But that's what we would call Yom Kippur, the day. And you'll notice that there's some consistency in the requirements. On the 15th day of the 7th month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. You shall observe a feast to Yahweh for 7 days. You shall present a burnt offering. An offering by fire is a soothing aroma to Yahweh, 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old, which are without defect. And their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for each of the 13 bulls, 2/10 for each of the 2 rams, and 1/10 for each of the 14 lambs, and 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering, its grain offering, and its drink offering. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is all the same. Okay, all one thing, all the way through 40. On the second day, this is the Sukkot. This is actually a more modern representation of the booths. You've heard of the Feast of Booths. People build these in their yard, and that's where they essentially reside in commemoration of wandering in the desert. And so there's a certain order to these things. On the second day, 12 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect. Their grain offering and their drink offerings for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs by their number according to the ordinance. 1 male goat for a sin offering. besides the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and their drink offerings. Then on the third day, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, their grain offering and their drink offerings for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs by their number according to the ordinance, and 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and its drink offering. On the fourth day, and this is a 7-day period, right? 10 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect. Their grain offering and their drink offering for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs by their number according to the ordinance, 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering, its grain offering, and its drink offering. And this is repeated each day for Sukkot. Now on the 5th day, 9 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, their grain offering and their drink offering for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs by their number according to the ordinance, 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and its drink offering. And then on the 6th day, 8 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, their grain offering and their drink offerings for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs, by their number according to the ordinance, and 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering, its grain offering, and its drink offerings. Then on the 7th day, 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, and their grain offering and their drink offerings for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs, by their number according to the ordinance. And 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering, its grain offering, and its drink offering. On the 8th day you shall have a solemn assembly. You shall do no laborious work. But you shall present a burnt offering, an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to Yahweh, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, their grain offering, their drink offerings for the bull, for the ram, and for the lambs by their number according to the ordinance, and 1 male goat for a sin offering, besides the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and its drink offering. You shall present these to Yahweh at your appointed times, besides your votive offerings and your free will offerings, for your burnt offerings and for your grain offerings and for your drink offerings and for your peace offerings. Moses spoke to the sons of Israel in accordance with all that Yahweh had commanded Moses. So he's saying these are the ones. You're going to offer these, in addition to everything else that you decide to offer, the free will offerings and the votive offerings. And remember, we're getting towards the end of Moses' life, right? Yahweh has already told Moses there is coming a time here shortly where you're going to be gathered to your fathers, which is a nice way of saying your body's going to drop dead in the desert, because that was what was foretold. So this is the calendar. The calendar is largely a calendar of Sabbaths, isn't it? They're not to do any work on those days. They're simply to worship in convocation. One day they blow trumpets. The other days they're supposed to rest. It's a far cry from my experience growing up in holidays. Normally on Thanksgiving we were fixing the house somehow, because that was the one day customers didn't expect stuff to be delivered. So, we would put flooring in or do that or whatever. And by the time we got to Thanksgiving dinner, nobody felt like eating anything. It just felt like crashing. But you weren't supposed to do that. I like that God includes that. You're not supposed to work on these days. It's not just about the sacrifices. You can't just get the sacrifices done and then go plow or go harvest or whatever. That's not supposed to happen. Any questions or comments about that section there? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in verse 7, it just says you should do no work. Yeah. There is a difference, yes. So the Sabbath standard was no work, all right? Every seventh day was no work. In other words, normal things like even cooking your breakfast, you weren't supposed to do that. But there is a difference. I don't think that they could spend a whole month doing no work at all, like they didn't have refrigeration. So you can't just make a bunch of food ahead for a whole month in their environment, in that climate. So there is a difference between the laborious work and just the work. You wouldn't go out and try to break a new field on that day. That would count as laborious work. When I was a kid, that's how we gardened. My dad didn't know what a tiller was till after I was already grown. We got turning forks and went and turned it by hand, and that's how they did it. That's laborious. If you've never done it, it doesn't matter how big your garden is. By the time you get done, you're tired of turning that with a hand fork. I think we had about 400 square feet in the backyard. It was probably the biggest my dad's garden was in that suburban lot. But if it got overgrown one year, it was horrendous. So that sort of thing. All right. So we can go on to chapter 30. I think we have time to probably finish. This is principles regarding vows, okay, and it's unique in some ways because it's not really talking about the vows, which vows are permissible and which ones aren't. We've already talked about Nazirite vows and free will vows and things like that. You were allowed to make a vow, right? You were in Israel. You were allowed to say, God, I'm going to do this, and it was considered a good thing as long as you fulfilled the thing. I'm just going to give you a view of chapter 30. Chapter 30 is that you need to take your vows very seriously. And if you make a vow to Yahweh in the nation of Israel, you need to keep it. Right? There's a New Testament standard that is different than this. But within the nation of Israel, this was a commonplace thing. And it was not supposed to be done lightly, which is kind of the idea here in chapter 30. And that's verse 2. But let's start reading in verse 1. And if y'all have questions as we're reading, you can go ahead and stop me. I'll try to remember where I get stopped. That's okay. But this has some interesting theological implications, so I do want to spend some time on it. As then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the sons of Israel, saying, "This is the word which Yahweh has commanded. If a man makes a vow to Yahweh or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." Now, we have a unique thing in English where we call something swearing that isn't swearing. You have a bunch of four-letter words for excrement. You have vulgarities, right? We call that swearing. That's not really swearing, right? You may not want to say that in your grandma's house or your mom's house. But those are vulgarities. That's not swearing. When he says, when we're talking about here, swears an oath or makes an oath and it's binding, the way they did that was not to make an exclamation like, who was the famous tennis player that never kept his racket in his hand? What was his name? Y'all remember? McEnroe, yeah. All I ever remember that guy was seeing his tennis racket flying through the air. Common enough. If you're in control of your emotions, you probably wouldn't be a professional athlete for the most part. It seems to be a common affliction. Yeah, that's not swearing. That's just being vulgar. These people, when they swore, they would say something like this: "May Yahweh strike me down if I don't do what I say I'm going to do." That's the way they would do that. And if you made a vow like that and then you didn't keep it, you were taking the Lord's name in vain, right? That's what taking the Lord's name in vain is, not using it. Not saying Jesus, not saying Yahweh. There are certain people that would be highly offended that I use the word Yahweh the way it's written in Scripture when the Lord is in all caps, because the Jewish tradition is not to pronounce that name. In fact, they write it so that it's almost unpronounceable. Or it is unpronounceable at their vowel pointing, so that they didn't accidentally take the Lord's name in vain. But saying God, saying Jesus, saying Yahweh is not taking his name in vain. It is using it to secure a vow that you're not going to keep in vanity. You know, you're lying about it. All right? So Yahweh says if you bind yourself to a binding obligation, you are essentially doing what I've done. God does, right? You realize that God is not bound by anything except his own promise, right? He keeps all of his promises perfectly, but no one can demand that of him. I cannot say, this is the fallacy of the blab it and grab it movement, right? The name it and claim it prosperity gospel, that I can now bind God to give me something that he actually didn't promise me. Prosperity. He didn't ever promise me that. Did he promise Israel prosperity? Yeah. Conditional prosperity. If you meet the conditions, you'll be prosperous. But he never promised the church prosperity. Ever. Future glory, yes. Future reward, yes. Eternity, yes. But it's a whole different animal. So you'll find that most prosperity preachers go dig deep into the Old Testament and try to claim promises that aren't theirs in order to prove their point. And you can't even explain to them why they're wrong, hardly, because they've been doing it so long. They don't even know, they have no idea when you try to explain to them there are different audiences in the Bible. It's not written to you. It's not written about you. It's barely, it is written for you. You're supposed to know how God dealt with Israel, but not how it's supposed to direct your prayer life. So please don't pray for a house that you didn't build or a vineyard you didn't plant. You don't get that. That wasn't made to you. Lots of people live in houses they didn't build for dang near free these days, but that's not because God is blessing them. Jacob and I talk about this with some regularity because it's a common thing in certain church cultures in El Paso to thank the Lord for something that came because of the government. The government stole some resources from somebody else and redistributed it to somebody else that didn't earn it. Oh, praise God. Well, God may be in the process of judging the government that does that. That's the way I see it. Because it's unrighteous. So let's not thank God for doing something that he didn't do and that he's judging a nation for doing, in my opinion. I was wrong the one time, you'll understand, right? I could be wrong one more time, but I don't think I am. All right, so here's one that's going to make everybody mad. It even makes the male feminists mad. Verse 3, also, if a woman makes a vow to Yahweh and binds herself by an obligation in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and her obligation by which she has bound herself, and her father says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand. And every obligation by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father should forbid her on the day he hears of it, none of her vows or her obligations by which she has bound herself shall stand. And Yahweh will forgive her because her father had forbidden her. Doesn't sound very modern. Sound very contemporary. It's not. But we still do this. It's not just, we just don't limit it to a woman, right? So up until somebody's 18, can you go into a recruiting office at 17 by yourself and sign up to go march in Uncle Sam's army? Nope. What do you need at 17 if you want to go join? You can join the army at 17. What do you need? Me. And probably, I think maybe both parents, I'm not sure. It's at least one has to give you approval. You can sign all the paperwork. Most 17-year-olds can sign their name these days, even if they are mostly illiterate in this country, for all intents and purposes. And by illiterate, I don't mean that they can't read the words, but their reading comprehension is nearly non-existent, apparently. People who can read well and do math well don't vote Democrat, people. That's just how it happens. Right? If you can read what the Constitution says and you can read what those people are saying and you can comprehend it, you don't do that. You don't vote for socialism. Throw in a little history there and it becomes impossible. But this is a standard, right? And this is the benefit of the patriarchal priesthood here, essentially, that existed in this culture and this climate and this country. You could bind yourself, but your father held a veto power over what you said. And mostly civilizations have understood that this is required. Now, what would this do if you were trying to extract a vow from a woman in her father's household? Would you do it? Would you bother? I don't think so. I just go to her dad. and say, what do you think about this? See, this is what people get their knickers in a twist about. That girl has a right to live her own life. Not if her daddy has to pay for it, she doesn't. Not while she's living in his tent and eating his animals and under his protection, she doesn't. And I don't care if you're 35, if you're still doing that, your daddy should probably still tell you when you can have a credit card or not. I mean, that's just practical. People forget this crap. This is just normal expectation. This is supposed to avoid abuse. It's supposed to avoid abuse, to tell people, don't even bother making a contract with somebody still living in daddy's basement. Don't do it, or tent, or whatever. They didn't have basements on tents. That's kind of counterproductive. So the father had veto power. Now, verse 6 goes on. This really gets people's knickers in a twist. All right. However, if she should marry while under her vows, or the rash statement of her lips by which she has bound herself. In other words, Daddy hadn't heard about it yet. But Daddy said, you're going to get married. And she gets married, and Daddy still hasn't heard about the credit card that she signed up for, or whatever. They didn't have credit cards, but you know what I mean. She happens to get married. And she's still under, I like that, the rash statement of her lips, by which she has bound herself. And her husband hears of it and says nothing to her on the day he hears it. Then her vow shall stand, and her obligations by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if on the day her husband hears of it, he forbids her, then he shall annul her vow, which she is under, and the rash statement of her lips, by which she has bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. You know what they're saying here? This is a woman that was in her father's house saying, yes, I promise to do that, and may the Lord strike me dead if I don't do it. The father has the obligation in this situation, and the husband has the obligation to save her life to cancel that vow, because she has placed herself under that condition. And in a sense, obligated the house that she lives in to fulfill the vow, which is not hers to do. It's not hers to do. By the way, this is the United States worked until about the 50s, 60s maybe. As I understand it. I wasn't born then. My parents weren't born until halfway through the 50s, so. But as a student of history, the Lord will forgive her. In other words, she can continue living, even though she has pronounced a death sentence on herself if she doesn't keep the promise. But the vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, everything by which she has bound herself shall stand against her. All right. The vow of a widow or a divorced woman, everything by which she has bound herself shall stand against her. Now, in our culture, everyone's like, I'm going to be a divorced woman then, because then what I say goes. That's the dumbest thing ever to say. Didn't we just cover that? The father and the husband are keeping this woman alive, having made a rash promise. That should and could result in her physical death. Yeah. What happens if she's widowed or divorced? Everything by which she has bound herself shall stand against her. Doesn't mean she can't make a rash promise, a rash statement, or bind herself to a death sentence, but no one can save her. Right? Yes? Nobody's nodding. Everybody's getting modern on me. I'm not asking you to say what we should be doing now. I'm just trying to explain to you what was happening then. There was a reason it was terrible for a woman to be on her own in this culture. And this time, not just in this culture, this is actually a major upgrade. Major upgrade. Remember, the 5 daughters came and said, we think we ought to have our father's inheritance. And Yahweh said, you know what, that's right. In Israel, that's what's going to happen. But it does place them in danger here to some degree. She's bound by what she says, right? Now, where However, if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by an obligation with an oath, and her husband heard it, but said nothing to her and did not forbid her, then all her vows shall stand. Every obligation by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband indeed annuls them on the day he hears them, then whatever proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning the obligation of herself shall not stand. Her husband has annulled them, and Yahweh will forgive her. She doesn't have to die. So now why is this, why I told you this has other implications, right? Because we're not under this law. You don't live under the law. You didn't come to church with a goat. I mean, right? Hopefully not. No. You can come to church with a goat. You don't even know what an ephah is. And you don't usually mix your flour with oil, and you don't burn it up on an altar. What does it matter? So I remember one day, Priscilla and I went to a puritanical private school, which I really was blessed by. I joke about it, but it was this is a different category of discipline than I was accustomed to by the time I got there in 7th grade, academically speaking. And I remember one day that somebody asked, he was probably everybody's favorite teacher, Mr. McCulloch. And all of the male teachers taught chapel. They were supposed to be qualified to do that, and he did it regularly. But they asked him, he wasn't our Bible teacher, that was Pastor Saul at the time, and they asked Mr. McCulloch, well, what would have happened in the Garden of Eden if Eve had just eaten the fruit and Adam had refused? Well, Mr. McCulloch is a very pragmatic man. He said, well, sounds to me like Eve would have suffered the effects of sin and Adam wouldn't have. And maybe God would have made him a new helper or whatever, but he would have still been essentially immortal, and she would not have been. And that's a long time ago. I don't know how long, y'all remember back, but I remember certain conversations like this. This was probably 8th or 9th grade that I was in when I remember this conversation taking place in homeroom. That's how nerdy I am. I remember things like that. But as I progressed, right, I thought about this principle here, that this is what Yahweh considers. And if Adam had corrected Eve in the garden, I don't think that Eve would have suffered that either, personally. I think that essentially that was a vow that would have been annulled by her husband in the garden and should have been restored. Because remember, Adam wasn't there as far as I can tell. She came up to him later and said, hey, that's some fruit. There was some failure there. On his part, I think, but it would have been annulled. That's I don't have a direct line to that connection, and I was wrong the one time, but that's what I think. All righty. Any questions or comments about this modern and progressive standard? Yeah. I'm glad you said it that way. Yeah.
It does. It seems like, hey, I don't have responsibility.
Yeah. I think so. And as a person that is trying to manipulate somebody else, I think it serves as a serious consideration to not try to manipulate people through their spouse like that. And that happens today, quite frankly. I won't. Just from the grapevine, right? We had a Republican mayor in El Paso at one time who has what I understand to be a flaming liberal spouse. And so when he doesn't act like a Republican, I go, I wonder what they talked about at the dinner table.
What about males in the house, underage males? It doesn't mention it here, but what do you...
Well, remember that the males became responsible for the law at 13. They were either not responsible at all, or they were very responsible. This is unmarried people, so they might have been married early, but
really males 13 and up.
They were responsible for what they said, but females were not. So they could make a vow and they had to pay it, and Daddy wasn't responsible for that. They were responsible for all of the law that day, on that day. Yeah, you're right. It is freeing, actually, in a lot of ways. It's not seen that way today. But I will, y'all know that I'm a bit of a student of history. Oh, we're over time. I'll say this so y'all can get mad at me and talk to me at coffee time. But since universal suffrage, we've spent a lot more time at war than we ever did. And people tell you if women were in charge of the world, that the world would be less violent, and that is evidently not true at all. We've spent years and years and years, proportionately more in the last century, at global and localized wars since universal suffrage than we ever did before. So we need to have our eyes open when we understand the roles that God has defined in the world. All right? So I told you can get mad at me over donuts. We're done, so we're way over time. But Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the example of the laws that you set up in your nation, in Israel, before they came to the land and gave them instructions for it. And we thank you for the example that it sets. For your character, it should be evidenced in laws that are in a country. And we appreciate that. We love you. It's your son's name we pray.